Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxation Bedtime History. Tonight you are stepping into the heavy breath of a stone castle in the year 1327, where winter presses its face against every wall, and the kitchen is the only place still alive with warmth. You are not in a bedroom with soft silence and curtains. You're in a vast medieval kitchen where firelight flickers across blackened beams, where servants move like stews, and where the smell of burning wood, roasted meat, and damp stone blends into something strangely comforting. Outside, frost is already crawling over the courtyard like pale fingers, and you quickly realise this is not the kind of place you would last long in if you were truly alone. You probably won't survive this without the fire keeping you alive through the night. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it fascinating how this little story reaches people in completely different nights across the world. Now, dim the lights, flow straight into the story, no extra headings. The moment you step deeper into the castle kitchen, your eyes take time to adjust to the shifting glow. The hearth is enormous, almost like a small indoor sun trapped behind iron spits and hanging pots. You feel the heat on your face immediately, uneven and alive, as if the fire itself is breathing. This is not just a place for cooking, it is the heartbeat of the entire castle, especially in a winter like this one in the early 14th century. When records show that English castles relied heavily on centralised kitchens to feed entire households of nobles, knights, and servants, that is a mainstream historical fact that feels almost too practical until you're standing here, half blinded by smoke. You notice how your boots stick slightly to the stone floor, damp from melted frost that has been carried in by hurried footsteps. Around you, servants shift with practiced precision, their movements shaped by repetition rather than comfort. There is a quiet sense of urgency in everything they do, even when no one is speaking. A quirky detail from some medieval household accounts suggests that kitchen cats were sometimes formally assigned to keep grain stores safe from mice, almost as if they were part of the staff roster. You imagine one somewhere in the shadows, eyes glowing faintly, completely indifferent to your presence. A servant gestures you toward a corner near the hearth. It is not generous so much as practical. Warmth radiates outward in uneven circles, and the closest spots are reserved for those who must stay awake already. You lower yourself carefully onto a pile of straw sacks. They rustle loudly, far louder than you expect, and you suddenly become aware of how sound carries in this space. Every clink of metal, every scrape of wood, every cough from a tired cook echoes upward into the rafters above you. The beams are dark with soot, layered with years of smoke that never fully escaped. Medieval kitchens like this often had crude ventilation systems, sometimes just a hole or louver in the roof, and historians still argue whether these designs were primarily effective engineering or simply the best compromise available to people working with limited materials and constant fire. You can almost feel that debate hanging in the air like the smoke itself, unresolved and gently academic, while your body is far more concerned with staying warm. You pull a rough wool cloak tighter around your shoulders. It smells faintly of old sweat, ash, and herbs. Someone nearby is chopping wood, each strike of the axe sending a sharp crack through the room. Another pot boils over slightly, releasing a hiss that makes everyone glance over without panic, as if even small disasters are routine here. You begin to understand that this kitchen is not chaotic, it is structured chaos, a rhythm everyone has learned to live inside. A young kitchen boy, no older than perhaps 13, notices you watching and gives a tired smile. He explains, almost casually, that no one truly sleeps deeply in winter. There is always someone awake, always someone tending the fire or checking the smoke. He speaks like this is normal, like rest is just another shared duty, Rather than a private retreat, you listen, half amused, half comforted, as he demonstrates how to tuck straw under cloaks to trap rising heat from the hearth. As the evening continues, the fire shifts colour. Deep orange becomes pale gold at the edges, and shadows grow longer across the stone floor. You realise that your chosen sleeping place is not really a bed at all, but a negotiated survival zone between warmth and smoke. A servant passes by and tosses another log into the fire, sending a brief burst of sparks upward for a moment. The whole kitchen glows brighter, and you catch sight of hanging herbs drying near the ceiling, their shapes twisting in the heat currents. The smell changes too. Roasting meat fades slightly, replaced by the heavier scent of wood ash and warm stone. You settle deeper into the straw, feeling your muscles slowly accept the uneven surface. It is not comfortable in any modern sense, yet there is a strange reassurance in the consistency of it. Everything here is built for function, not softness. Somewhere deeper in the castle above you, a noble feast is being prepared, or perhaps already beginning. You hear faint echoes of distant voices and the occasional burst of laughter that does not belong to your space. It reminds you that this kitchen is both central and hidden, essential yet invisible to those who dine above. That separation feels almost symbolic, like two worlds stacked on top of each other, one of comfort and one of labour. You shift slightly, trying to find a position where the heat from the hearth balances the chill creeping from the stone beneath you. The cold is persistent, patient. It waits for gaps in warmth, seeping through cracks in the floor and into your bones. You realise quickly that sleep here is not a surrender. It is an arrangement with the environment, a negotiation with fire, smoke, and exhaustion. The kitchen boy returns briefly, placing a small wooden bowl near you. It contains a thin broth, still warm. He does not explain it. He simply leaves it there as if this is part of the silent economy of survival. You sip it slowly, letting the warmth spread through you, and for a moment the world feels almost stable. Outside, the courtyard is fully frozen now, though you cannot see it directly. You only sense it through the way the air behaves when someone opens a door. A sudden blade of cold slicing briefly into the kitchen before being swallowed again by firelight. That contrast becomes the rhythm of your awareness, heat and cold trading dominance in invisible waves. You lie back, eyes half open, watching the ceiling beams blur into darkness and glow. The fire crackles steadily, and the kitchen continues its quiet work around you, somewhere in the back of your mind. You understand that this is what night means here. Not silence, but continuity. The fire never really stops changing shape. Even as you settle into the straw near the corner, it keeps pulling your attention back as if it has its own quiet will. You start to realise that in a castle kitchen like this in 1327, the hearth is not just a tool for cooking. It is a constant presence that dictates how people move, where they stand, and even how they breathe. The heat rolls outward in waves, uneven and alive, reaching your face one moment and fading the next as someone shifts a log or stirs a pot. You watch the flames rise higher as fresh wood is added. The logs are heavy, half charred from earlier in the day, and when they're pushed into the centre of the fire they release a deep, almost musical crackling sound. Sparks lift upward and disappear into the soot-darkened beams above. This kind of open hearth cooking was common in medieval European castles, especially before fully developed chimney systems became widespread in many regions. That is a mainstream historical fact. But when you're lying here, it feels less like history and more like physics happening right in front of you. The fire is not contained in the way modern kitchens would expect. It spreads across iron grates, spits, and suspended hooks where pots swing gently. You notice how everything is designed around control rather than enclosure. The heat is managed, not trapped. Someone nearby rotates a large spit of meat slowly over the flames, their hands steady from repetition, The meat glistens in the firelight, and fat occasionally drips into the coals, causing brief flares that light up the entire kitchen in sudden golden flashes. You shift slightly on the straw, feeling how the warmth changes depending on where you're positioned. One side of your body is almost too hot while the other still carries the memory of the stone floor's cold. It is an uneven comfort, but it is comfort nonetheless. Around you, the kitchen continues its steady rhythm. A pot bubbles softly. A ladle taps the edge of a cauldron. Someone coughs, then wipes their hands on a rough cloth and continues working without pause. There is a sense that the fire is the real authority here. Not the cook, not the steward, not even the lord who will eventually eat the food prepared over it. Everything defers to the hearth. Even conversation bends around it, rising and falling depending on how loudly the flames are roaring at any given moment. A quirky detail from some medieval household traditions suggests that certain kitchens believed in placing carved wooden charms or iron figures near the hearth to prevent the fire from misbehaving or burning too low during important feasts. It sounds almost superstitious, but when you see how central this fire is to survival, it becomes easier to understand why people might attribute personality to it. You find yourself almost doing the same, watching it as if it might respond to attention. A cook passes by and tosses a handful of herbs into a pot. The scent that rises is sharp and earthy, cutting through the heavier smell of smoke and fat. Rosemary and thyme drift upward, mixing with ash and heat until the entire room feels layered with scent in a way that is almost physical. Your eyes sting slightly, but not unpleasantly. It is part of the atmosphere, part of the cost of staying near the only reliable source of warmth in the castle. You notice how the stone surrounding the hearth is blackened in uneven patterns. Years of fire have left marks that cannot be cleaned, only added to. The stones closest to the flames are almost glossy in places, smoothed by constant heat. Above, iron hooks hold pots of different sizes, each one swinging slightly whenever someone bumps into the chain. The entire structure feels like a machine built from fire and patience. Historians still argue whether medieval hearth placement in large kitchens was primarily designed for efficiency, or whether it evolved more from tradition than deliberate engineering. Standing here in the glow, you can imagine both arguments. Efficiency is obvious in the way everything is within reach of the flame. Tradition is equally obvious in how little the system seems to change even when it could be improved. A servant kneels briefly to adjust the logs, pushing them inward with a long iron tool. The fire responds immediately, brightening and shifting, as if acknowledging the correction. You find yourself tracking every small interaction between human and flame, realizing that this is a constant negotiation. Too much wood and the smoke thickens, too little and the kitchen risks losing its only warmth. Your breathing slows as your body adjusts further to the heat. The initial shock of cold stone beneath you begins to fade into background discomfort rather than immediate concern. You become aware of how deeply your senses are being shaped by this environment. Modern silence does not exist here. Even stillness has sound in the form of crackling wood and simmering pots. At one point, a small burst of smoke rolls outward unexpectedly, filling the lower half of the room. It drifts low before being pulled upward by the imperfect ventilation above. You watch it rise and vanish through the ceiling gap, realizing how crude but functional the system is. Smoke never fully disappears here. It just moves, circulates, and eventually escapes in uneven waves. Another interesting detail from some historical records mentions that kitchen workers sometimes wore damp cloths over their mouths during peak cooking hours to avoid constant irritation from smoke. You imagine someone nearby doing exactly that, moving through the haze with practiced indifference. It gives the whole scene a strange sense of endurance, as if everyone here has simply accepted a certain level of discomfort as normal life. You shift again, and the straw rustles loudly for a moment, A nearby servant glances in your direction, then returns to work without comment. There is no sense that you are unusual here. You are simply another body close to the heat, another presence benefiting from the fire's reach. The fire itself seems to deepen in colour as the night progresses. Bright yellow give way to deeper oranges, and occasional red cores that pulse like a slow heartbeat. The sound changes too. The sharp crackling softens into a steadier, more continuous rumble. It is almost hypnotic. You find your thoughts slowing in response, becoming less structured and more impressionistic. Somewhere above, faint movement suggests the upper halls are still awake, though distant. You cannot hear words clearly, only the suggestion of activity beyond stone and distance. Down here, the kitchen feels like a separate world entirely, one defined not by ceremony but by survival. You begin to understand that this hearth is not just keeping you warm, it is organising your entire perception of time. Moments are measured in logs added, pot stirred, and flames rising or falling. There is no clock, only fire behaviour. As you watch, a final log is placed carefully onto the edge of the hearth rather than the centre. A small act that seems almost deliberate, as if preparing the fire for a slower burn through the later hours. The flames accept it without protest, settling into a steady rhythm. Your eyes grow heavier, but the fire continues its quiet conversation with the room, and you remain within its glow. Suspended between warmth and sleep, the warmth of the hearth does not reach everywhere, and as you lie there in the kitchen's corner, you begin to notice how sharply the castle divides itself between heat and cold. Even a few steps away from the fire, the air changes. It grows thinner, quieter, and somehow more serious, as if the stone itself is reminding you that comfort is not evenly distributed here. You shift slightly on the straw, and the sound it makes feels louder than it should, echoing faintly off the walls. The stone around you is massive and uneven, built from blocks that were placed long before your arrival in this imagined year of 1327. In many medieval castles, thick stone walls were the primary defence against both enemies and weather, a mainstream historical fact that becomes very tangible when you feel how they trap cold instead of keeping it out. There is no insulation in the modern sense. Instead, the walls absorb winter and slowly release it back into the room, like a memory that refuses to fade. You press your hand against the wall near you. It is cold enough that your skin reacts immediately, pulling warmth away as if the stone is drinking it. A faint draught moves through a crack between two stones, not strong enough to be seen, but constant enough to be felt. It slips across your fingers and disappears into the larger body of the kitchen. You start to realise that this place is full of invisible movement, currents of air shaped by architecture rather than intention. Somewhere deeper in the kitchen, a servant drags a sack of grain across the floor. The sound is dull but persistent, scraping slightly with each movement. You notice how sound behaves differently here compared to modern spaces. The stone does not absorb anything. It reflects everything. Even quiet footsteps seem to carry farther than expected, bouncing between walls and beams. A quirky detail from some medieval building practices suggests that certain castles used layers of animal hair, straw, or even moss between stones during construction to reduce drafts. It sounds almost improvisational, as if builders were experimenting with whatever nature provided. You imagine those hidden layers tucked inside the walls around you, holding back the cold in ways you will never see but still slightly benefit from. You roll onto your side, facing away from the hearth for a moment. Instantly, the temperature difference becomes obvious. The warmth behind you feels distant now, replaced by a steady chill that creeps along the floor. The straw beneath you is not enough to fully separate your body from the stone. It bends and compresses, offering comfort only in suggestion rather than true softness. A servant passes by and briefly blocks the firelight. In that moment, the entire corner you are lying in darkens and cools further. When they move away, the glow returns, and you are reminded how much your environment depends on movement. Nothing here is stable. Everything changes with proximity. You notice small alcoves built into the walls, some holding jars, others empty. These recesses are practical, but they also break the monotony of stone, creating pockets where objects and shadows gather. One jar is slightly cracked, and a thin line of dried residue runs down its side. It might once have held oil or preserved food, both essential in a time when storage determined survival through winter months. Historians still argue whether castle kitchens were deliberately placed in certain parts of the structure to balance heat distribution to nearby rooms above. Standing here, you can imagine that debate unfolding across centuries. While your current reality is simply trying to keep warm enough to fall asleep, the cold air continues to move, not aggressively but persistently. It finds gaps in your clothing, edges of sleeves, the space between collar and skin. You pull the cloak tighter again, noticing how quickly your body adjusts to this constant negotiation. Warmth is never fully secure, it must always be maintained. Another servant enters briefly carrying a bundle of firewood. As they pass, you catch a stronger wave of cold air from the doorway behind them. The outside world is briefly revealed in sensation rather than sight. You imagine the courtyard beyond, frozen solid, with frost covering stone paths and wooden carts locked in place by winter's grip. Then the door closes again, and the kitchen returns to its contained universe of fire and stone. You begin to understand how deeply this architecture shapes behaviour. People do not linger near cold walls, they cluster around heat sources. Even conversation seems to happen in warmer zones, as if language itself prefers comfort. The kitchen becomes a living map of temperature, with invisible borders separating survival from discomfort. A cook leans briefly against the wall near you while checking a hanging pot. They do not seem to notice the cold in the same way. Their body is adapted through repetition, through countless winters spent in similar conditions. You wonder how long it takes for stone to stop feeling like an enemy, and instead become something simply accepted. The fire behind you crackles again, and a wave of heat rolls across the floor. It meets the colder air from the walls in a subtle collision, creating a layered atmosphere that you can almost feel shifting across your skin. It is not just hot or cold, it is both at once, constantly negotiating space. You adjust your position slightly, trying to find a balance point where neither extreme dominates. The straw rustles again, softer now as you move more slowly. Your body begins to recognize patterns in the temperature, learning when warmth will return and when cold will press forward. A faint draft moves across your ankles, and you instinctively tuck them closer. It is remarkable how quickly the body prioritizes heat preservation when surrounded by stone and winter. There is no thinking required, only reaction. The kitchen boy from earlier passes at a distance, carrying a small bundle of herbs. He glances toward the wall where you're lying and gestures vaguely, as if indicating that this corner is both the warmest and the least comfortable depending on how the fire behaves. He disappears into the haze of smoke and light without stopping. You notice now that even the smoke behaves differently near the walls. It rises unevenly, sometimes clinging briefly to colder surfaces before drifting upward again. The ventilation above is imperfect, allowing small pockets of haze to linger longer than others. The ceiling feels alive in its own way, shaped by heat currents and structural gaps. A second quirky historical note appears in your mind from scattered medieval records describing how some kitchens used hanging bundles of dried herbs, not only for cooking, but also to mask the smell of damp stone and smoke that never fully left the walls. You can almost smell that mixture now, faint rosemary blending with ash and moisture. The cold continues its slow work. But it no longer surprises you. It has become part of the environment, like the fire or the sound of wood shifting. You realise that comfort here is not a permanent state. It is a temporary arrangement between body, fire, and architecture. As you settle deeper into the straw again, your breathing slows. The contrast between warmth and cold becomes less dramatic and more rhythmic, like waves moving across a shoreline. The kitchen continues its steady life around you, indifferent yet sustaining. The rhythm of the kitchen shifts almost without warning, like a breath being drawn deeper into the chest of the castle itself. What felt like a slow, steady warmth moments ago becomes something more urgent, more structured. You sense it before you fully understand it. Movement increases, voices sharpen slightly, footsteps become more deliberate, less wandering. The kitchen is preparing for something larger than itself. You remain in your corner near the hearth, still wrapped in the uneven comfort of straw and wool. But the space around you is no longer passive. A cook calls out an order, and another responds without hesitation. Wooden boards are dragged into place. Knives begin their steady work against surfaces. The air fills with the layered sound of preparation rather than rest. In the early 14th century, large households and castles often operated kitchens that served dozens or even hundreds of people at once, especially during feasts or seasonal gatherings. This is a well-documented historical reality, and you feel its weight in the sudden expansion of activity around you. Nothing here is small-scale. Even simple meals require coordination that would resemble a modern production line if it were not so dependent on human hands and memory. A large cauldron is pulled closer to the fire, its iron handles groaning slightly under the weight. Two servants work together to tilt it just enough for ingredients to be added. Steam rises immediately, carrying the scent of onions, leeks, and something meat-rich that clings to the back of your throat. The smell is dense but not unpleasant. It feels like warmth made visible. You watch as baskets are brought in from storage alcoves. One contains root vegetables, another dried grains, and a third holds salted meat wrapped in cloth. Each item is handled with care, not delicacy, but awareness of value. Nothing is wasted easily in this world. Preservation techniques such as salting, smoking, and drying were essential to medieval food systems, a fact supported by numerous household accounts and archaeological finds across Europe. Without them, winter survival would have been far more precarious. A servant near you pauses briefly to sharpen a knife on a worn stone. The sound is rhythmic and grounding, almost meditative. You find yourself listening to it more than watching anything else for a moment, as if it provides structure to the surrounding motion. Then the pace increases again. Bread dough is carried in heavy wooden bowls, its surface dusted with flour. It has already been kneaded into the thick consistency, and now it is being shaped for baking. Someone presses it down firmly, releasing a soft sigh of air. Another places it near a warmer section of the hearth where residual heat can help it rise slowly. You notice how each task is distributed among people who seem to know exactly where they belong without needing instruction. Experience replaces formal direction. Younger workers observe and imitate, while older ones move with quiet authority. The hierarchy is visible but unspoken. A slightly unusual medieval practice recorded in some manor accounts mentions that certain kitchens experimented with flavouring stews using fermented fruit residues, giving dishes a sweet and sour complexity that might surprise modern palates. You imagine such a mixture simmering nearby, adding another layer to the already overwhelming sensory environment. Smoke thickens briefly as more wood is added. The ventilation struggles for a moment, and the air becomes dense enough that shapes blur at the edges. Then it thins again as heat currents pull it upward through the roof opening. The system is imperfect, yet it functions through constant adjustment rather than fixed design. You shift slightly on the straw, careful not to obstruct anyone moving past. The kitchen is now fully awake in a way that feels different from earlier. Before, it was maintenance. Now it is creation. Every movement has a purpose tied to timing and expectation. Large knives strike chopping blocks in steady repetition. Vegetables are reduced to smaller and smaller pieces, each motion efficient but not rushed. A pot lid is lifted briefly, releasing a burst of steam that carries herbs and meat juices into the air. The scent is richer now, almost overwhelming in its depth. In many noble households of the period, kitchens were strategically positioned near service corridors to streamline food delivery to great halls above. That architectural choice becomes easier to understand as you watch trays being prepared and stacked for transport. The system is designed for movement, not stillness. A servant brushes past your corner and adjusts the fire again. Flames respond instantly, brightening the entire room for a moment before settling. The fire behaves almost like a participant in the process, reacting to human decisions with immediate effect. You catch sight of a small boy carefully counting wooden tokens laid out near a shelf. He seems to be tracking portions or deliveries, moving pieces from one pile to another with focused attention. There is something almost modern in the way numbers and organization quietly underpin the chaos. A lesser-known detail preserved in some regional records suggests that kitchen workers occasionally marked certain pot with carved symbols to indicate contents when literacy was not widespread among lower staff. It is a simple system, but effective in a world where memory and routine carry more weight than written labels. The pace begins to stabilize after its initial surge. Preparation continues, but it settles into a steady rhythm rather than frantic motion. You feel the shift in your own body as well. What felt like sudden noise becomes background again, though still active. You adjust your position slightly, leaning more into the warmth that radiates from the hearth. The contrast between activity and stillness creates a strange sense of balance. You're both observer and part of the environment now, neither fully outside nor fully involved. A cook pauses nearby and tastes something from a wooden spoon. Their expression changes subtly, not dramatically, but enough to signal approval. A small nod passes between them and another worker. No words are needed. The adjustment is made immediately, as if the recipe itself is being negotiated in real time. You realize how much trust exists in this space without formal documentation. Knowledge is carried in repetition, not writing. Adjustments are remembered through muscle and habit rather than instruction manuals. Outside, unseen beyond stone and frost, the winter night continues to press against the castle. Inside, the kitchen resists it with heat, movement, and coordination. You begin to understand that this room is less a single place and more a system of survival, operating at full capacity. As the preparation continues, your eyelids feel heavier again, but the warmth around you keeps you anchored. The smell of cooking deepens, blending with smoke and wood until the air itself feels thick enough to rest inside. The kitchen settles into a different kind of motion now. Not the sharp urgency of preparation, but the sustained endurance of continuation. You notice it in the way footsteps soften, in how voices drop slightly, in how movements become less about starting tasks and more about maintaining them. The fire remains the constant center, but everything around it adjusts its pace as if agreeing to a shared rhythm. You remain in your corner near the hearth, and the straw beneath you has begun to flatten into a shape that vaguely remembers your body. It is not comfortable in any modern sense, yet it has become familiar enough that your muscles stop resisting it. The warmth from the fire rolls across you in uneven layers, sometimes intense, sometimes fading, depending on who tends the logs. In many medieval castles of the early 14th century, kitchens were designed not only for the cooking but also for managing entire cycles of labour that extended late into the night during large household operations. This is a widely accepted historical understanding based on surviving household accounts and architectural remains. You feel that structure now in the way tasks continue even as the sense of urgency fades. A cook lifts the lid of a large pot, releasing a thick plume of steam that briefly obscures the far side of the room. The vapour rises quickly, then thins as it reaches the upper beams where soot has darkened the wood over years of repeated use. The smell is deeper now, layered with slow-cooked meat, herbs, and something slightly sweet from softened root vegetables. It lingers in the air rather than passing through it. You shift slightly and notice how the floor beneath you responds with a dull chill that never fully disappears, even this close to the hearth. Cold persists in pockets, reminding you that warmth is never absolute here. It is always negotiated. The stone absorbs heat slowly and releases cold just as slowly, creating a constant tension beneath every surface. A servant nearby adjusts a hanging chain that holds a pot above the flames. The metal creaks softly as it is raised a fraction higher. This small adjustment changes everything, altering boil intensity, steam output, and even the brightness of reflected firelight. You begin to understand how finely tuned this environment is, even if it appears chaotic at first glance. A lesser-known detail found in some household records suggests that kitchen staff often rotated responsibilities throughout the night to prevent exhaustion during long feasting cycles. That idea makes immediate sense here. You notice how different individuals step in and out of tasks without formal announcement, as if roles are passed like invisible objects between hands. The fire pops sharply, sending a brief spark upward. It disappears into the darkness above, where the beams hold it for a moment in reflection before it fades. You find yourself watching those small sparks more closely than anything else. They feel like punctuation in an otherwise continuous sentence of heat and motion. A group of workers gathers briefly near a side table, speaking in low tones. Their conversation is too quiet to fully hear, but the tone suggests coordination rather than rest. One of them gestures toward a set of bowls, another nods and moves away without hesitation. The exchange is efficient, almost minimalistic. You become aware of how sound behaves differently as the night progresses. Earlier it was sharp and scattered, now it is smoother, more layered. Even chopping wood sounds less like interruption and more like background rhythm. The kitchen is not quieter, but it has become more cohesive. At the edge of your vision, a boy carefully counts portions of bread again, moving small pieces from one stack to another. His focus is steady, almost meditative. You realize that repetition here is not boredom, but structure. It is how order is maintained in a space that never truly stops moving. A quirky observation preserved in some regional medieval accounts describes how certain kitchens believed that the first bread baked during the large preparations carried symbolic importance and was sometimes set aside for household staff rather than served at the main table, whether practical or symbolic. It reflects how meaning and labour often overlap in this environment. You adjust your cloak slightly, feeling how heat and smoke have begun to settle into the fabric itself. It no longer feels like an external layer, but part of the atmosphere you carry. The smell of wood smoke clings to everything here, including your thoughts, which seem slower now, more receptive to repetition. The fire shifts again as another log is added, but this time the change is gentle. No sudden flare, just a gradual deepening of glow. The hearth seems to exhale rather than ignite. You notice how even small changes in fuel placement can alter the entire mood of the room. Historians examining medieval domestic spaces often highlight how central hearths shaped not just cooking practices, but social interaction patterns within service areas. That idea becomes tangible here as you observe how people naturally orient themselves toward the fire, even when not working directly with it. It is a gravitational center disguised as heat. You lean back slightly, feeling the straw compress further beneath you. Your body begins to sink into its uneven support, and instead of resisting it, you allow it to hold you in place. The discomfort becomes background noise rather than active sensation. A servant passes near you carrying a wooden tray stacked with bowls. The movement is careful but unhurried. Nothing spills, nothing falters. The coordination required for this kind of work is subtle, built from repetition rather than instruction. You realize how much trust exists in these movements, trust in balance, timing, and shared awareness of space. The kitchen's soundscape continues to evolve. There are fewer abrupt noises now, more sustained ones. The hiss of simmering pots replaces sharp boiling bursts. The crackle of fire becomes a steady undercurrent rather than a dominant force. You notice how your perception of time begins to blur. There are no clear markers here, no clocks or bells that divide the night into clean segments. Instead, time is measured in shifts of activity, changes in heat, and the gradual softening of voices becomes harder to distinguish moments from one another. A faint draft passes through the room again, reminding you that outside still exists as a separate, colder reality. The air it brings is sharp and brief, cutting through the warmth before disappearing into the higher reaches of the kitchen. The contrast is almost startling each time it happens. A small group near the fire laughs briefly at something said. The sound quick and contained, it fades just as quickly, absorbed back into the steady rhythm of work. You notice how even laughter here is brief, not discouraged but naturally limited by context. A quieter detail from archaeological interpretations of medieval kitchens suggests that wear patterns on stone floors often reveal invisible paths of repeated movement, showing how people instinctively followed certain routes between fire, storage, and preparation areas. Looking around, you can almost trace those invisible paths yourself. Your eyes grow heavier again, but the warmth remains consistent enough to keep you alert in a drifting way. It is not full wakefulness anymore, but something softer, a suspended awareness between rest and observation. The fire settles into a long, steady burn, and the kitchen continues its quiet, coordinated endurance around you. The night deepens in a way that is not announced but simply felt. You notice it first in the firelight. It no longer flickers with earlier intensity. Instead, it stretches, elongates, and softens across the kitchen like a tired glow that has decided to keep going anyway. Shadows settle more heavily into the corners, and even the stone seems to absorb the light rather than reflect it. You are still in your corner near the hearth, though the space now feels slightly different, as if the kitchen has quietly rearranged itself while you are not paying attention. Fewer people move at once. Those who do move seem more deliberate, more economical in their gestures. The rush of preparation has faded into sustained maintenance, the kind of work that carries on because it must, not because it is urgent. In medieval castle households of the 14th century, the kitchen often operated through staggered shifts during long winter nights, especially when preparing for feasts or managing large estates. That is a widely supported historical understanding based on household records and surviving account rolls. You can feel that system now in the way people cycle through tasks without clear transitions, as if sleep is something negotiated rather than scheduled. A servant kneels near the hearth and rearranges embers with a long iron tool. The motion is slow and practiced. Each shift of coal changes the shape of heat in the room. You watch how the glow intensifies in one direction while dimming in another, as if the fire is breathing sideways. The sound is subtle, a soft scrape of metal against burning wood, followed by a low settling crackle. You adjust your position slightly, feeling the straw beneath you compress further. It has long since lost any illusion of softness. Instead, it has become a textured layer between your body and the cold stone beneath. That stone remains constant, always present, always patient. It does not change temperature quickly, it simply waits. A lesser-known detail found in some estate inventories mentions that certain kitchens kept small reserves of dry rushes or straw specifically for overnight rest near the hearth. Not as bedding in the modern sense, but as insulation against stone floors during long working cycles. You begin to understand why such a simple material mattered so much in this environment. The air shifts again as someone opens a distant door. A brief wave of cold enters, sharp enough to be noticeable even from your position near the fire. It cuts through the kitchen in a clean line before dissolving into the warmer air above the hearth. You instinctively pull your cloak tighter, though the cold has already passed. The fire responds to new fuel being added with a gentle rise in brightness, not a dramatic flare, but a steady strengthening. The flames elongate and twist upward, catching on fresh wood. Sparks drift into the darkness above and vanish into the soot-stained beams that have witnessed countless nights like this one. You notice how the kitchen's sound has changed again. Earlier it was layered and active. Now it is sparse but continuous, the occasional clink of metal, a soft footstep, the low murmur of someone speaking too quietly to carry far. It feels less like a workplace and more like a living organism that has entered a slower metabolic state. A cook stirs a pot with long circular motions, occasionally tasting the contents with a wooden spoon. Their expression suggests adjustment rather than approval or disapproval. A small tilt of the head, a brief pause, then another stir. You realize how much of this work is instinctive, guided by repetition rather than measurement. In some surviving medieval culinary manuscripts, there are references to flavouring techniques that rely on balance rather than precise quantities, where cooks were expected to adjust seasoning based on sight, smell, and texture rather than written instruction. You can almost see that principle in action here. In every subtle correction made over the fire, you shift again, and the straw rustles solidly softly. The sound seems louder than it should in the quieter kitchen. A nearby servant glances briefly in your direction, then returns to their task without comment. There is no sense of interruption here, only coexistence. The hearth remains the centre of everything. Even now, as activity slows, it continues to dictate movement. People drift toward it when idle, then away again when work calls. It is not just a source of heat, but a point of orientation, almost like a compass that everyone subconsciously follows. A faint smell of herbs rises again as a bundle tied near the ceiling shifts slightly in the warm air currents. Dried rosemary and thyme release their scent slowly, softened by smoke. The aroma blends with wood ash and simmering broth, creating a layered atmosphere that feels both dense and strangely calming. A quieter, almost overlooked detail from archaeological studies of medieval kitchens suggests that repeated exposure to smoke often left visible staining patterns on textiles and hair, marking kitchen workers as distinctly separate from those in higher social spaces. You imagine that boundary now, invisible but persistent, carried in smell and colour rather than words. You lean your head back slightly against the rough stone wall. It is still cold, but less shocking than before. Your body has begun to adapt in small ways, finding balance points between heat and cold, noise and silence, motion and stillness. The fire dims slightly as a log settles inward. For a moment, the room feels lower, as if the ceiling has descended closer. Then the flames stabilize again, returning to their steady rhythm. You realize how much of your perception is tied to these fluctuations. A servant moves quietly across the room carrying a covered pot. The lid rattles faintly with each step. They pass through a brighter patch of firelight, then disappear into shadow near the far table. The movement feels almost ghost-like in the dimming light. There is a sense now that the kitchen is holding itself together. Rather than actively building anything, the work continues, but it is gentler, more repetitive, maintenance rather than creation. The difference is subtle but important. You find your breathing slowing in response, not forced, just influenced by the environment, the rhythm of the fire, the softness of sound. The reduced motion all contribute to a gradual easing of alertness. A final small detail emerges from some regional household accounts describing how certain kitchens assigned one person the task of ensuring embers remained alive through the night, carefully tending the fire so it would not fully die before morning. You can almost identify that role here in the quiet attention given to the hearth. Your eyelids grow heavier, again, but you remain aware enough to notice the balance of heat around you. One side of your body warm, the other slightly cooler. The stone beneath you steady and unchanging. The fire still breathing softly at the centre of it all. The kitchen continues its slow, enduring rhythm as the night moves deeper into stillness. The kitchen feels different again, not because anything dramatic has changed, but because your body has begun to accept it as a temporary home. The straw beneath you is no longer just uneven bedding. It has become part of the environment, like the stone, like the smoke, like the steady breathing of the hearth. You're no longer reacting to every shift in temperature. Instead, you're adapting to it in small, almost unconscious ways. The fire remains active, but its personality has softened. Earlier it felt like something demanding attention. Now it behaves more like a steady companion that simply refuses to leave. The flames are lower, stretched out across glowing embers that pulse gently whenever new air reaches them. You watch how a servant nudges a partially burned log inward, not to increase heat dramatically, but to preserve a slow, reliable burn. Around you, the kitchen has entered its late-night phase. Work still exists, but it is quieter, spaced out, and less crowded. People move with the kind of efficiency that comes from repetition rather than urgency. There is no sense of stopping, only of reducing intensity. Even conversation has thinned into occasional murmurs that rise and fall like distant waves. You notice how the architecture begins to feel more present now that human activity has softened. The stone walls are no longer just background surfaces. They feel like enclosing memory, holding warmth that was built up over hours and slowly releasing it back into the room. Cold still exists at the edges, but it is less aggressive than before. More like a reminder than a force. A servant passes by carrying a bundle of iron tools, their shapes dark against the firelight. The metal reflects brief flashes of orange as they move. Their footsteps are careful, not because the floor is dangerous, but because the rhythm of the kitchen has become delicate. Everything here now is about not disturbing the balance that has been achieved. In some surviving household records from medieval estates, there are descriptions of kitchens that never fully extinguished their hearth fires during winter nights, maintaining embers continuously to avoid the difficulty of relighting them in freezing conditions. That continuity becomes almost tangible here. The fire is not restarting, it is simply enduring. You shift slightly, and the straw rustles softly beneath your weight. The sound feels more noticeable now that the room is quieter. A nearby worker glances in your direction briefly, then returns to their task. There is no curiosity, only shared presence. You are simply another body staying near the heat. The air carries a mixture of scents that has become increasingly familiar. Smoke, wood ash, slow-cooked broth, and faint traces of herbs that have been hanging above the hearth for hours. The smell is no longer sharp. It has blended into something continuous, almost like an atmosphere rather than a collection of separate ingredients. You watch as a pot is lifted slightly and tilted. The liquid inside moves slowly, thickened by long cooking. Steam rises in a thin stream rather than a burst, suggesting that the intensity of heat has decreased. The cook tastes it, pauses, and adds something small from a nearby bowl. The adjustment is subtle, almost invisible, but it changes the scent immediately. The kitchen feels less like a workspace now and more like a sustained environment of maintenance. Not building, not finishing, just keeping everything in motion at a manageable level. Even the fire participates in this shift, its brightness reduced but steady, like a low heartbeat that refuses to stop. You become more aware of small details that earlier were lost in noise. The faint creak of wood as beams adjust to heat and cooling, the soft clink of ceramic against stone, the occasional exhale of someone resting their weight briefly against a table before moving again. Each sound is isolated but gentle, not competing for attention. A kitchen worker moves quietly toward a side shelf and retrieves a wrapped bundle. When opened, it reveals dried food stores, carefully preserved for long use. The act is simple, but it speaks to the underlying structure of survival here. Nothing is spontaneous, everything is prepared for continuity. In certain medieval estate inventories, references appear to layered storage systems within castle kitchens, where ingredients were organised not just by type but by expected duration of use through winter months. That kind of planning becomes visible in the way items are handled here, with an almost invisible logic guiding every movement. You lie back slightly, feeling the wall behind you now less like a barrier and more like support. The cold is still present, but it no longer dominates your attention. Instead, it exists alongside the warmth rather than opposing it directly. The fire shifts again as embers collapse inward. A soft glow spreads outward in response. Not bright, but still. It feels like the room is exhaling slowly. The atmosphere becomes heavier in a calming way, as if the kitchen itself is settling into rest without fully stopping. A faint conversation occurs near the far side of the room. It is too quiet to distinguish words clearly, but the tone suggests coordination of remaining tasks. There is no urgency left, only completion of small obligations before the night deepens further. You notice how the sense of time continues to dissolve. There are no clear divisions left, no beginning or end to moments, only transitions in warmth, sound, and movement. The kitchen no longer feels like a sequence of events but a continuous state. Your body responds to this shift. Breathing slows, muscles loosen. Attention drifts more easily between firelight and shadow. You're not falling asleep yet, but you're no longer fully anchored to alertness either. The hearth remains the center of everything, but even it has quieted. Its glow is steady, low and persistent, enough to hold the room together, not enough to dominate it. The kitchen continues its slow, uninterrupted endurance as the night deepens further into stillness. The kitchen has reached a stage where everything feels stretched thin, as if the night itself has been drawn out over stone and fire until only the essential parts remain. Movement still exists, but it is sparse now, spaced apart like quiet footsteps across an empty hall. The fire is no longer roaring or even steadily active in the way it was earlier. Instead, it's a low, persistent presence, glowing from within a bed of embers that seem to breathe rather than burn. You are still lying in your corner near the hearth, and the straw beneath you has long since lost any sense of novelty or discomfort. It simply is what it is, a thin barrier between your body and the cold stone floor that never fully gives up its chill. Your awareness of it fades in and out, depending on how much warmth reaches you at any given moment. A servant moves slowly across the kitchen, carrying a small bundle of wood. The steps are unhurried, careful, almost ritualistic. When they place the wood near the hearth, it is not thrown in or dramatically added. It is arranged with intention, as if preparing for a long continuation rather than an immediate change. The fire responds quietly, a soft brightening that spreads through the embers without breaking their calm. In many medieval households of the early 14th century, nighttime kitchen maintenance involved keeping a controlled ember bed rather than allowing fires to fully die out, especially during winter months when relighting could be difficult and time-consuming. That practice becomes visible here in the way every action is designed to preserve continuity rather than initiate change. You notice how the air has stabilized. Earlier it shifted constantly between thick smoke and clearer currents, but now it has settled into a more consistent texture. The smell of wood ash is still present, but it has softened, blending with faint traces of broth that linger in the stone and wood surfaces. Even the scent of herbs feels more distant now, as if it has been absorbed into the room rather than floating through it. A cook leans over a pot and stirs slowly, but the motion lacks urgency. It is more like maintenance than preparation. The surface of the liquid inside reflects the firelight in slow ripples, each movement echoing the low energy of the hearth. Steam rises in a thin stream, barely noticeable unless you are watching closely. You shift slightly, and the straw makes a quiet sound that feels louder than it should in the reduced atmosphere. A nearby worker glances briefly in your direction, then returns to their task without pause. There is a shared understanding in the room now that nothing unexpected is happening. Everything is within the expected rhythm of the night. A faint draught slips through the kitchen again, but it is weaker than before. It does not cut through the space so much as brush against it. The fire flickers in response, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the change. You find yourself noticing these small interactions more than anything else. The kitchen has become a system of subtle responses. Some estate accounts from medieval England describe kitchens that were built with deliberately thick stone partitions near hearth areas to retain heat during long winter operations. That kind of architectural intention becomes easier to imagine here, where every surface seems to hold warmth for only a limited time before releasing it back into the cold. You rest your head more fully against the wall. It is still cold, but it no longer feels harsh. Instead, it feels like a fixed part of the environment that your body has learned to negotiate with rather than resist. The contrast between warmth and cold is still present, but it has softened into balance rather than conflict. The fire dims slightly again as one of the embers collapses inward. For a moment, the room feels lower, as if the ceiling has leaned closer. Then another ember catches, and the glow returns gently. There is no sudden change, only adjustment. The hearth is not active in a dramatic sense anymore. It is simply continuing. A servant quietly adjusts a hanging pot chain, raising it slightly so that the contents remain warm without beetling further. The movement is poised and practiced. The metal creaks softly, then settles. You realize how much of this environment depends on constant small corrections rather than large actions. A less commonly noted detail from archaeological studies of medieval domestic spaces suggests that repeated wear patterns near hearths often indicate preferred resting zones for workers during overnight shifts, where warmth and accessibility to tasks intersected. You can almost feel those invisible patterns beneath you now, as if your own resting place is part of that accumulated history of use. The kitchen's soundscape has thinned further. What remains is steady rather than layered. The occasional soft scrape of wood, a quiet shift of feet, the low murmur of someone speaking briefly before falling silent again. Even the fire itself has become more sound than light, its crackle reduced to a gentle background rhythm. You notice how your breathing has slowed in response, not intentionally, but as a reflection of the environment around you. The kitchen is no longer encouraging alertness, it is guiding everything towards stillness without fully stopping. A cook tastes something again from a spoon, pauses, and nods slightly. The adjustment made earlier appears to have settled correctly. No further changes are needed. The motion is almost ceremonial in its simplicity, like confirming that the system is still functioning as expected. You become aware of how deeply embedded repetition is in this space. Every action has been performed so many times before that it no longer requires conscious effort. It exists as memory in the hands rather than thought in the mind. The fire shifts one more time, and the embers glow in a slow pulse. It is not bright, but it is steady enough to anchor the room. The darkness around it feels softer now, less absolute. Shadows remain, but they are no longer threatening or heavy. They are simply present, A final small detail from regional medieval household notes mentions that kitchens often relied on shared understanding rather than explicit instruction during night cycles, allowing work to continue even when supervision was minimal. That idea is visible here in the way everyone moves without needing direction. You lie still, feeling the bayonets between warmth and cold, sound and silence, presence and fading awareness. The kitchen continues around you, but it no longer demands attention. It simply exists, holding its shape through the night. The embers glow steadily as the space settles deeper into quiet endurance. The night has moved into its quietest register now, the kind of silence that is not empty but carefully maintained. You can still hear the kitchen, yet it no longer feels like a place of constant action. Instead, it has become a slow-breathing organism held together by ember light and habit. The fire sits low in the hearth, no longer leaping upward, but holding itself together in a glowing bed that pulses gently like something half asleep. You remain in your corner near that warmth, and your body has started to accept the uneven logic of it. One side of you is warm enough that it almost feels heavy, while the other carries the cool reminder of stone that never truly forgets winter. The straw beneath you has fully flattened now, shaped by hours of stillness and subtle shifts. It no longer rustles much when you move, as if it too has settled into the rhythm of the night. A servant passes slowly through the kitchen, carrying a small iron tool used for adjusting coals. Their steps are measured, not cautious but familiar, as if they are walking a path they could trace even in complete darkness. When they reach the hearth, they kneel without ceremony and gently pull embers closer together. The fire responds with a faint deepening of colour, a soft orange glow spreading outward like a slow exhale. Hail. In many medieval households of the early 14th century, keeping the hearth alive through the night was considered essential not just for warmth, but for practical continuity. A dead fire meant lost time in the morning, and in cold seasons that loss could be significant. That understanding shapes everything you see here, from the careful spacing of embers to the deliberate placement of wood for gradual ignition rather than sudden flame. The air feels more stable now, though it still carries the layered memory of earlier activity. Smoke is present, but no longer overwhelming. It clings lightly to the beams above and drifts in slow, almost lazy currents toward the roof opening. The smell of cooking has softened into something more ambient, as if the kitchen has absorbed its own history of the night. You shift slightly, and the straw responds with a muted sound. It feels less like material now and more like part of the floor itself. A nearby worker glances briefly in your direction, then resumes what appears to be a routine check of hanging pots. There is no interruption in their movement, no acknowledgement beyond a passing awareness. You are simply another body within the shared space of warmth. A quiet conversation occurs near the far side of the kitchen. The words are indistinct, but the tone suggests coordination rather than storytelling or rest. One voice rises briefly, then fades as another responds. The exchange is minimal, efficient, and quickly concluded. After that, silence returns almost immediately. You notice how the firelight now behaves differently. Earlier it was active, flickering and unpredictable. Now it is steady, almost contemplative. Shadows no longer jump or shift dramatically. Instead, they stretch slowly across the floor and remain there, as if they have chosen their positions for the remainder of the night. A less frequently mentioned detail from medieval estate records describes how some kitchens maintained a specific arrangement of stones within the hearth to control airflow and ensure that embers remained evenly distributed overnight. That principle becomes visible here in the way the fire holds itself together, without collapsing into ash or flaring into renewed activity. You become more aware of your own breathing. It has slowed further, not because of effort, but because the environment encourages it. There is no urgency left in the room. Even the air seems to move at a reduced pace, as if it too is conserving energy. A cook lifts the lid of a pot briefly, releasing a thin ribbon of steam that rises and dissolves into the dim light. They do not taste it this time, only observe it, then settle the lid back into place. The motion feels like confirmation rather than adjustment. Everything appears to be functioning as expected. You begin to notice how sound has become extremely selective. The kitchen is not silent, but its sounds are isolated and spaced far apart. A faint creak of wood, a soft shift of metal chain, the distant sound of someone exhaling. Each one stands alone for a moment before dissolving into the larger stillness. A small ember breaks away from the main cluster and glows briefly on its own before fading. The servant near the hearth gently nudges it back into place. The action is almost tender, as if returning something fragile to safety. The fire responds without protest, maintaining its slow rhythm. Some historical descriptions of medieval service spaces suggest that night hours were often considered a separate operational phase, where the goal was not productivity but preservation of readiness. That concept becomes almost tangible here, where everything is designed to ensure that morning can begin without disruption. You adjust your position again, and this time the movement feels almost unnecessary. Your body is no longer seeking comfort in the traditional sense, it is simply maintaining alignment with the warmth available. The cold stone beneath you remains present, but it no longer competes for attention. A servant moves quietly along the edge of the room, checking each pot in sequence. Their hands move with practiced certainty. Nothing is opened unnecessarily, nothing is disturbed. It is a routine of confirmation, not intervention. The firelight flickers slightly as a draft passes through, but the change is brief and quickly absorbed. The kitchen barely reacts. It has entered a state where external variation is acknowledged but not disruptive. You find yourself drifting between awareness and rest more easily now. Thoughts are no longer structured in clear lines. They move in softer patterns, shaped by warmth and sound rather than intention. The kitchen continues around you, but it no longer anchors your attention fully. A final subtle detail from archaeological interpretations of medieval hearth spaces suggests that repeated use over time created a natural hollow in the centre of many fire pits, shaped by the constant gathering of embers and ash. That invisible shape feels present here, even if unseen, as if the fire has carved its own resting place into the stone. The embers glow steadily, and the kitchen holds its quiet form through the deepening night. The kitchen feels as though it has exhaled into a long, sustained pause, not silence, not stillness, but a softened continuation of everything that came before. The fire remains alive, yet it no longer dominates the room. It sits low in its stone cradle, glowing like a patient animal curled into itself, content to endure rather than perform. You're still in your corner near the hearth, and by now your body understands this place in a way your mind never fully catches up with. The straw beneath you is no longer something you notice in texture. It is simply part of the ground you're resting on, a flattened memory of movement and settling. Warmth reaches you in slow pulses from the fire, uneven but steady enough to keep you anchored. A servant crosses this kitchen without haste, carrying a long iron rod used for adjusting the deeper layers of embers. They do not look around much. Their attention is entirely on the hearth, as if the rest of the room exists only at the edges of necessity. When they kneel, the motion is practiced and almost invisible in its efficiency. Embers are gently drawn together, not stirred into flame but guided into cohesion. In medieval castle households of the early 14th century, hearth maintenance during night cycles was an essential task assigned to specific workers whose responsibility was to preserve heat continuity until morning operations resumed. That structured continuity becomes visible here in the way every small adjustment is aimed at preventing collapse rather than creating change. The fire responds with a quiet deepening of glow, no flare, no dramatic shift, only a slow tightening of light that spreads across nearby stone. The walls reflect it faintly, holding on to warmth that has been built over hours. The kitchen feels less like a place with a fire and more like a place shaped by it. You shift slightly, and the straw makes a muted sound that barely travels beyond your immediate space. Even that small noise feels softened by the atmosphere. A nearby worker glances briefly in your direction, then returns to their task of checking a suspended pot. There is no interruption, only acknowledgement of shared presence. The air carries a layered stillness now. Smoke is present but subdued, drifting in thin streams toward the roof opening. It no longer fills the room in thick waves. Instead, it lingers lightly along beams and corners, as if reluctant to fully leave. The scent of cooked food has become faint, absorbed into wood and stone over the course of the night. A cook lifts a ladle and lets a small amount of liquid fall back into a pot. The motion is slow, observational rather than active. A slight nod follows, suggesting satisfaction with this consistency. The pot is left alone afterward, its contents left to maintain themselves over low heat. You notice how the rhythm of the kitchen has shifted again, becoming almost procedural. Tasks still occur, but they are spaced widely enough that each one feels isolated. A step here, a clink there, a brief adjustment of fire or pot chain. Between these moments stretches a thickened quiet that feels intentional rather than accidental. A lesser-known detail from preserved estate inventories describes how some medieval kitchens kept small side embers separate from the main hearth, specifically for warming utensils or maintaining gentle heat overnight without disturbing the central fire. That layered approach to fire management becomes visible in the way heat seems distributed rather than centralized. You lie back more fully, feeling the wall behind your shoulders. It is still cold, but no longer sharply so. The cold has become familiar enough that it no longer interrupts your awareness. Instead, it exists alongside warmth, creating a balance that your body has begun to accept. The fire shifts slightly as a log settles deeper into the embers. The glow contracts, then steadies again. The movement is almost imperceptible, but you notice it because everything else has slowed enough to make small changes meaningful. A servant walks to the far side of the kitchen and checks a hanging bundle of herbs. They adjust its position slightly, ensuring it remains above the heat but not too close to direct smoke. The herbs release a faint scent as they move, briefly refreshing the air before fading again into the background. You become aware of how repetition has replaced urgency entirely. Every action you see now is a continuation of something already established, not the beginning of anything new. The kitchen is maintaining itself rather than producing or transforming. A brief conversation occurs near the hearth, but it is reduced to fragments of sound. A few words, a pause, a short reply, ends quickly, dissolving back into quiet. No one lingers on speech longer than necessary. In some interpretations of medieval domestic architecture, the arrangement of kitchens within castle layouts is as often linked to both thermal efficiency and logistical access to storage and service corridors. That structural reasoning feels present here in the way movement naturally flows between fire, shelves, and preparation tables without hesitation. You notice how your perception of time has become increasingly fluid. There are no clear markers of progression, only shifts in brightness, sound, and motion. The night does not advance in steps anymore. It deepens in layers. A small ember breaks loose and rolls slightly within the hearth before being gently nudged back into the cluster by a practiced hand. The action is almost instinctive. Nothing is allowed to drift too far from the center of controlled heat. Your breathing slows further, not consciously but as a reflection of the environment. The kitchen no longer encourages alertness or reaction. It supports a softer kind of awareness, one that does not demand focus. The fire holds steady, its glow reduced but unwavering. Shadows rest in place without shifting. The room feels suspended, in a long, stable moment that refuses to end or begin. You remain within that warmth, balance between stone and flame, as the kitchen continues its quiet endurance through the deepening night. The kitchen no longer feels like a place moving through time. It feels like a place holding time in place, stretching it gently so nothing breaks. The fire is still alive, but it has become something closer to a slow heartbeat embedded in stone. Its glow is low and constant, spreading across the hearth in a soft amber pool that never quite fades and never quite brightens. You remain in your corner, and the straw beneath you has become indistinguishable from the idea of bedding itself. It is no longer separate in your perception. It is simply the surface you exist on, softened only by repeated pressure and the warmth that reaches it from the hearth. The cold stone beneath still exists, but it has retreated into the background of sensation, no longer demanding attention. A servant moves through the kitchen with quiet familiarity, carrying a set of clay jars that clink softly against each other. Each jar is sealed with wax or cloth, and their contents are treated with careful attention. They are placed near a cooler section of the wall, away from the direct heat. The motion is slow, deliberate, and entirely routine. In many medieval households of the early 14th century, storage of liquids such as wine, vinegar, and preserved broths relied heavily on thick ceramic vessels kept in controlled temperature zones within kitchens or adjoining cellars. That practical system becomes visible here in the way the jars are handled, with almost ritual care, as if each one carries not just food but continuity. The fire shifts slightly as a cluster of embers collapses inward. The glow deepens for a moment, then steadies again. There is no urgency in the change, only adjustment. The hearth is no longer reacting strongly to anything. It is maintaining itself with minimal intervention. You notice how the air has stabilized further. Smoke is present but diffused, no longer thick enough to form distinct layers. It moves in slow currents toward the ceiling opening, where it disappears gradually rather than escaping in bursts. The scent of ash has softened into something almost neutral, mixed with lingering traces of cooked grain and herbs. A cook leans over a wooden board, cutting something into smaller portions. The sound of the knife is steady but subdued. Each slice is part of a long continuation rather than a new task. The pieces are placed into a bowl with careful spacing, as if arrangement itself matters as much as preparation. You shift slightly, and the straw produces only the faintest sound. Even movement feels absorbed by the atmosphere now. A nearby worker glances briefly toward the hearth, then resumes checking a pot suspended over low heat. There is no communication, only shared awareness of the fire's condition. A lesser-known detail from preserved estate documents mentions that some kitchens designated specific areas near the hearth for storing liquids that required slow temperature stability, often marked informally by placement rather than written labels. That kind of spatial logic becomes visible here in the quiet organization of jars and vessels along the walls. The kitchen's rhythm has slowed into near uniformity. Actions occur at wide intervals, separated by stretches of stillness that feel deliberate rather than empty. A pot is stirred, a chain is adjusted, a bundle of herbs is checked. Each motion stands alone before dissolving back into quiet. You become more aware of the architecture again. The stone walls are no longer just cold surfaces. They feel like accumulated memory, absorbing the history of heat and smoke from every hour of the night. The beams above are dark with soot, layered from countless cycles of fire and extinguishing, each one leaving invisible traces. A servant carefully lifts the lid of a pot and lets steam rise without interference. They do not stir or taste it immediately. Instead, they observe the surface briefly before allowing it to settle again. The action suggests confidence in process rather than urgency in correction. You notice how the firelight now behaves like a low tide. It expands slightly when air reaches the embers, then recedes into itself. The movement is slow enough that it feels like breathing rather than burning. The room adjusts to it without reaction. In some interpretations of medieval household organisation, kitchens are understood not only as production spaces, but also as thermal anchors within larger castle structures, influencing temperature distribution in adjacent rooms. That concept feels tangible here, as warmth seems to radiate outward even beyond your immediate space. A faint sound of wood shifting echoes from somewhere deeper in the hearth. A log settles into a more stable position. The fire responds with a soft increase in glow, then returns to its previous state. Nothing escalates. Everything stabilizes. You lie back slightly more, feeling the wall behind you. It is still cold, but the contrast between it and the fire is softened enough that neither dominates your attention. Instead, they exist together as balanced conditions, shaping your awareness without overwhelming it. A servant passes slowly along the edge of the room, pausing briefly to inspect a hanging pot before moving on. Their movement is nearly silent, broken only by the faintest scrape of leather against stone. They do not linger anywhere for long. Everything is part of a continuous circuit. A quieter detail from archaeological studies of medieval kitchen sites suggests that repeated patterns of soot accumulation often reveal long-term placement of hearth tools and storage items, indicating highly consistent spatial routines over time. You can almost sense those invisible patterns in the arrangement of objects around you. The kitchen now feels less like a workspace and more like a maintained environment. It is not actively producing change. It is preserving conditions. Heat, moisture, scent, and structure are all being held at a stable equilibrium. You notice how your own awareness mirrors that stability. Thoughts do not form in sharp sequences anymore. They drift in softer transitions, shaped by warmth and repetition rather than direction. A final adjustment is made to the embers, pulling them slightly closer together. The glow responds gently, holding steady afterward. The fire remains present, but it no longer demands attention. It simply continues. The kitchen rests in this quiet balance, sustained by firelight and stone, as the night settles even deeper into stillness. The kitchen has settled into a depth of night that feels heavier than earlier hours, not because anything has changed dramatically, but because everything has slowed to its most essential form. The fire is still present, yet it has become more like a memory of movement than movement itself. Its glow rests low against the stone hearth, spreading a soft, amber haze that barely reaches the far corners of the room. You remain in your place near the warmth, and by now your sense of position has simplified. There is heat, there is cold, and there is the narrow space between them where your body has learned to exist without resistance. The straw beneath you is fully compressed, no longer shifting or rustling in any noticeable way. It feels like part of the floor itself, softened only by the accumulated weight of time spent still. Across the kitchen, activity continues at a minimal level. A servant walks slowly from one side to the other, checking the hanging pots one by one. Their movements are spaced out, almost ceremonial in their repetition. Each pot is briefly lifted, inspected, and left to continue its quiet simmer above the low fire. Nothing is rushed, nothing is corrected unless absolutely necessary. In surviving estate records from the medieval period, there are repeated references to kitchens maintaining overnight embers specifically to ensure readiness for early morning bread preparation and household meals. That continuity of fire was treated as a practical necessity rather than a convenience, and you can feel that logic embedded in the way the hearth is treated here, never allowed to fully fade. The air has grown more uniform now. Earlier variations in smoke density and heat currents have smoothed into a consistent atmosphere. The scent of ash, wood, and softened herbs lingers without distinct peaks. Even the smell of cooked food has blended into the structure of the room, as if absorbed into stone and timber over the course of the night. You shift slightly, and the straw responds with only the faintest suggestion of sound. A nearby worker pauses briefly, then continues adjusting a chain above the fire. The metal moves slowly, producing a soft creak that fades quickly into the surrounding quiet. There is no sense of interruption. Everything flows within the same subdued rhythm. The fire itself behaves differently now. It no longer flares or collapses noticeably. Instead, it maintains a steady, internal glow that seems almost self-sustaining. Embers pulse faintly, rising and falling in brightness in a pattern that feels more biological than mechanical. The hearth has become less an object and more a condition of the room. A quieter historical observation preserved in architectural studies of medieval kitchens notes that stone hearths often developed heat retention properties over long periods of continuous use, effectively turning them into thermal reservoirs that stabilized surrounding temperatures even when flames were low. That principle becomes almost tangible here, as warmth seems to linger in the very surfaces around you. A servant near the far wall adjusts a bundle of dried herbs hanging from a beam. The motion is careful, ensuring the bundle does not drift too close to residual smoke. As it shifts, a faint fragrance is released, briefly brightening the air with something earthy and slightly sharp before fading again into the background. You become aware of how stillness has layers here. It is not absence of motion, but reduction of it to the point where each movement stands alone. A footstep, a breath, a soft shift of cloth. Each one appears and disappears without overlapping the next. At one point, a cook leans over a pot and lifts the lid just enough to observe the surface. The steam that rises is thin and slow, barely visible in the dim light. They do not stir or taste this time. The action is purely observational, a confirmation that everything remains stable. In some interpretations of medieval household organization, kitchens are understood as spaces where thermal management was as important as food preparation, influencing not only cooking but also the comfort of nearby service areas. That idea becomes easier to grasp as you feel how heat continues to radiate gently outward even in this reduced state of activity. You adjust your position again, though the movement is almost unnecessary. Your body has already adapted to the balance of warmth and cold. The wall behind you is still cool, but no longer sharply so. It feels like a steady presence rather than a contrast. A faint sound travels through the room as a log shifts slightly deeper into the embers. The fire responds with a mild deepening of glow, then settles again. There is no instability, only adjustment. The system holds itself in equilibrium through continuous minor corrections. A lesser-known detail from medieval household traditions suggests that certain kitchens believed keeping specific herbs near the hearth overnight helped maintain a favourable atmosphere for the coming day's cooking. A practice rooted as much in habit as in practicality, whether symbolic or functional. It reflects how closely environment and belief were intertwined in daily life. You find your awareness drifting more easily now, not into sleep fully, but into a softer state where observation and rest begin to overlap. The kitchen continues around you, but it no longer demands interpretation. It simply exists. A servant passes slowly through the central space, checking each station in sequence. Their path is predictable, almost circular, reinforcing the sense that the room operates on cycles rather than linear progression. Nothing begins or ends sharply. Everything transitions. The firelight dims slightly, then stabilizes again as embers settle. Shadows deepen but remain still, no longer shifting dramatically across the floor. The room feels held rather than illuminated, as if light itself has chosen to rest. A quiet exchange of words occurs near the hearth, too soft to distinguish clearly. The tone suggests confirmation rather than instruction afterward. Silence returns immediately, uninterrupted and complete. You notice how your breathing aligns more closely with the rhythm of the room. It slows without effort, matching the reduced tempo of everything around you. The boundary between your awareness and the kitchen's atmosphere feels less distinct. A final small adjustment is made to the fire, gathering embers into a tighter formation. The glow responds gently, becoming slightly more concentrated without increasing in intensity. The hearth remains alive, but it no longer changes in noticeable ways. The kitchen holds its quiet equilibrium, suspended in deep night, sustained by embers, stone, and the slow persistence of shared stillness. The kitchen has entered a state where even change feels optional. Nothing has stopped, yet nothing is pushing forward either. It is as if the entire room has agreed, without words, to maintain itself at the lowest possible level of activity until morning arrives. The fire remains alive, but it no longer behaves like something active. It feels more like a stored memory of heat resting inside stone. You are still in your corner near the hearth, and by now your body no longer distinguishes clearly between comfort and environment. The straw beneath you is fully flattened, forming a shallow impression that holds your shape without resisting it. The cold stone beneath still exists, but it has receded into the background of awareness, no longer interrupting your sense of stillness. Across the kitchen, movement continues in sparse intervals. A servant crosses from one side to the other, pauses briefly near a hanging pot, then adjusts its position by a fraction before continuing. The action is so measured, it almost disappears into the atmosphere. Nothing is rushed, nothing is delayed, everything simply continues. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, night operations in kitchens often relied on maintaining minimal but continuous supervision of hearths and stored provisions, ensuring that essential warmth and food preparation systems remained stable until dawn. That continuity is visible here in the way every action serves preservation rather than production. The fire glows in a compact formation now. Embers cluster together, emitting a steady, low light that barely reaches beyond the immediate hearth area. The brightness is soft enough that it no longer defines the room. Instead, it suggests presence rather than illumination. You notice how the air has become almost uniform. Earlier variations in smoke density, heat flow, and scent have dissolved into a single consistent atmosphere. The smell of wood ash and slow-cooked remnants is no longer distinct. It has blended into the very fabric of the space, as if absorbed by stone and timber over time. A cook stands near a pot, not stirring, not adjusting, simply observing. The act of watching feels as important as any physical intervention. After a moment, they nod slightly and step away, leaving the pot undisturbed. The decision is silent but final. A lesser-known detail preserved in some medieval estate accounts describes how kitchens often relied on informal spatial organisation during night cycles, with workers instinctively maintaining distance from colder zones of the room and clustering near residual heat sources without formal instruction. That behaviour becomes visible here in the natural grouping of bodies around the hearth. You shift slightly, and the straw produces almost no sound. Even movement feels absorbed before it can travel. A nearby worker glances briefly towards the fire, then resumes adjusting a chain that holds a suspended vessel. The metal gives a soft, muted creak before settling again. The fire responds to small changes in air with subtle fluctuations in glow, a faint deepening of colour, then a return to steady embers. These changes are so gentle they feel more like breathing than burning. The hearth no longer commands attention, it simply persists. A servant passes along the far wall carrying a small bundle of tools. Their path is familiar, repeated countless times through the night. Each step follows an invisible route shaped by repetition rather than instruction. Nothing deviates from expectation. A quieter observation from archaeological interpretations of medieval domestic spaces suggests that repeated heat exposure near hearths often resulted in gradual changes to stone coloration and surface texture. Revealing long-term patterns of use, that were never formally documented but remain visible in surviving structures. That idea feels present here in the way the hearth area seems visually different from the rest of the room, as if shaped by accumulated nights. You lean back slightly, feeling the wall behind you. It is still cold, but not sharply so. The contrast between warmth and cold has softened into coexistence. Neither dominates. Both are simply conditions that exist side by side. The fire shifts as an ember collapses inward. The glow tightens briefly, then relaxes again into its steady form. There is no disruption, only adjustment. Only the room remains stable. A faint exchange of words occurs near the centre of the kitchen. The tone suggests coordination of remaining tasks, though nothing urgent follows. The conversation ends quickly, dissolving back into silence without lingering effect. You begin to notice how your perception of time has become less structured. There are no clear markers of progression anymore, only subtle transitions in light, sound, and temperature. The night is no longer moving forward in distinct stages. It is deepening in a continuous flow. A final small adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them closer together. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated, but not brighter. It feels contained, like warmth gathered into a single resting point. A quirky detail found in some regional medieval kitchen traditions mentions that certain households believed the arrangement of embers overnight could influence the ease of lighting the fire the following morning, leading to careful shaping of coals into stable formations before rest periods. That practice aligns with what you see here in the deliberate clustering of heat. Your breathing slows further, aligning almost unconsciously with the rhythm of the room. The kitchen no longer demands awareness. It simply holds its state, sustained by firelight, stone, and habit. The embers glow steadily in the deepening night, and the space remains quietly intact around you. The kitchen has reached a point in the night where it feels less like a place you are observing and more like a condition you're inside of. The distinction between space and sensation has softened. There is heat, there is cold, and there is the long, quiet stretch between them where everything else exists in reduced form. The fire still lives in the hearth, but it no longer behaves like a source of change. It is simply a steady presence, glowing low and contained. You remain in your corner near the warmth, and by now your body has adapted so fully to the environment that even discomfort has become familiar. The straw beneath you is flattened beyond recognition as separate strands. It has become a continuous surface shaped by your weight and time. The stone beneath it remains cold, but the cold no longer rises sharply into awareness. It sits lower, like a background condition rather than an active force. Across the kitchen, movement continues in slow, spaced intervals. A servant walks past the hearth, pauses briefly to check the embers, then adjusts a single log that has shifted too far outward. The correction is small, almost invisible, but it changes the distribution of glow across the room. The fire responds gently, tightening its light into a more concentrated core before settling again. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, nighttime hearth supervision was considered essential to prevent both loss of heat and accidental extinguishing of fires that were difficult to relight during winter months. That practice forms the structural background of everything you see here, where even the smallest adjustments are made to preserve continuity rather than create change. The air feels heavier now, not in a suffocating sense, but in its completeness. Smoke has long since stopped behaving like a visible phenomenon. It has blended into the atmosphere so thoroughly that it is no longer something you notice moving. Instead, it feels like part of the room itself, embedded in wood, stone, and fabric. You shift slightly, and the straw produces only a faint rustle. Even that sound seems absorbed quickly into the surrounding quiet. A nearby worker glances toward the hearth, then returns to their task of adjusting a hanging pot chain. The metal gives a soft creak before settling, and the motion fades almost immediately. The fire itself remains low and steady. Embers glow in a compact formation, their brightness rising and falling in slow, irregular pulses. It is no longer a fire that demands attention. It is a fire that maintains itself through balance. Heat radiates outward in gentle layers, barely reaching the far corners of the kitchen. A cook stands near a table, hands resting lightly on its surface, simply observing a pot rather than interacting with it. After a moment, they nod slightly and step away. No change is made. The confirmation itself seems to be the task. A lesser-known detail from preserved medieval estate documentation describes how some kitchens use layered hearth arrangements, with outer embers reserved for maintaining ambient warmth while inner cores were carefully preserved for morning relighting. That kind of structural thinking becomes visible here in this way. Heat is naturally organised rather than actively controlled. You notice how the kitchen's sounds have reduced to isolated events. A single footstep, a brief scrape of wood, the soft clink of ceramic. Each sound appears fully formed, exists for a moment, then disappears without echo. There is no longer a continuous background of noise, only separated points of sound suspended in quiet. A servant passes slowly along the far side of the room carrying a small bundle of tools. Their path is familiar, repeated so often that it seems carved into the space itself. They do not hesitate or look around. Every movement is guided by memory rather than instruction. The fire shifts slightly as a small ember breaks free and settles deeper into the cluster. The glow responds with a brief tightening, then relaxes back into its steady state. Nothing escalates, everything stabilizes. A quieter observation from archaeological studies of medieval kitchen remains and suggests that repeated long-term use of hearth areas often results in subtle changes in surrounding stone coloration and texture, revealing patterns of heat concentration and human movement that are only visible after centuries of accumulated use. That idea feels almost tangible here, as if the space itself has been shaped by countless similar nights. You lean back slightly against the wall. It is still cold, but the sensation has softened further. The contrast between heat and cold is no longer sharp. It exists as a gradient rather than a boundary. Your body no longer reacts to it strongly, it simply exists within it. A faint exchange of words occurs near the hearth, too soft to fully distinguish. The tone suggests confirmation of routine rather than instruction. The conversation ends quickly, and silence returns immediately afterward. The kitchen no longer feels active in any conventional sense. It is maintaining itself through minimal intervention. The fire continues to glow, the pots continue to simmer faintly, the room continues to exist in a state of controlled quiet. You become more aware of your breathing again, though even that awareness is gentle. It follows the rhythm of the room without effort. The boundary between your presence and the kitchen's atmosphere feels thinner now, almost indistinct. A final adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them closer into a tighter formation. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated, not brighter, just more unified. The hearth holds its shape without resistance. A quirky detail preserved in some regional medieval kitchen traditions notes that workers sometimes believed the arrangement of embers at night could influence the stability of the fire into the following day, leading to careful shaping of coal clusters before rest periods began. That belief aligns with the quiet precision you see now in the fire's final arrangement. The kitchen remains suspended in deep night, held together by low firelight, softened sound, and the steady continuity of shared stillness. The kitchen feels as though it has stopped trying to become anything else, not in the sense of ending, but in the sense of settling fully into what it already is. The fire remains present, but it has reached its lowest sustainable form, a compact glow resting deep within the hearth. It no longer spreads light broadly across the room. Instead, it gathers itself into a contained warmth that gently suggests rather than illuminates. You're still in your corner near the hearth, and by now your body no longer registers the cold stone as something separate from the environment. It is simply part of the background conditions of existence here. The straw beneath you has completely lost any sense of texture in your awareness. It is flattened into a uniform surface that holds your shape without resistance or commentary. Across the kitchen, movement continues in long, spaced intervals. A servant crosses from one side to another, pauses near a hanging pot, checks its position, and then continues without hesitation. The motion is so practiced that it feels almost automatic, as if the body remembers the path more than the mind does. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, night kitchen supervision often relied on continuous low-level monitoring of heat sources and stored provisions to ensure readiness for early morning preparation cycles. That underlying structure becomes visible here in the way every movement serves preservation rather than transformation. The air has stabilized into a uniform presence. Earlier layers of smoke, steam, and scent have blended into a single atmospheric condition. You can still sense the history of the night in it, but nothing stands out sharply anymore. Everything has softened into continuity. You shift slightly, and the straw produces only the faintest suggestion of movement. Even sound feels reluctant to fully form. A nearby worker glances briefly toward the hearth, then returns to adjusting a chain that holds a pot suspended above the embers. The metal gives a muted creak, then settles into silence. The fire itself has become almost sculptural. Embers cluster tightly together, glowing in a stable pattern that rises and falls in slow pulses. It no longer reacts strongly to changes in air or fuel. Instead, it maintains itself through internal balance, as if it has learned how to persist without effort. A cook stands at a table with hands resting lightly on its surface. They are not actively preparing anything now. Instead, they appear to be verifying the condition of what has already been done. After a moment, they step away, leaving the space unchanged. A lesser-known detail preserved in some medieval estate records suggests that certain kitchens maintained multiple zones of residual heat within hearth structures, allowing different temperatures to coexist simultaneously for storage, warming, and slow cooking purposes. That layered thermal logic is visible here in the subtle differences of glow intensity around the fire. You notice how the kitchen soundscape has reduced further. There are no overlapping noises anymore. Each sound is isolated and complete. A single footstep, a soft adjustment of wood, a faint clink of ceramic. Each one appears, exists briefly, then dissolves into quiet without echo. A servant moves slowly along the far wall carrying a small bundle of tools. Their route is predictable, repeated so many times that it feels embedded into the space itself. They do not hesitate or look around. Every action is guided by memory rather than decision. The fire shifts slightly as a small ember collapses inward. The glow tightens briefly, then returns to its steady configuration. There is no instability, only adjustment. The hearth remains in equilibrium. A quieter observation from archaeological interpretations of medieval kitchen sites notes that repeated long-term use of hearth areas often results in distinct layering of soot and heat alteration on surrounding stone surfaces, revealing invisible histories of repeated occupation and movement. That idea becomes almost physical here, as if the kitchen itself carries accumulated memory in its structure. You lean back slightly against the wall. It is still cold, but the sensation has softened into something neutral. The contrast between warmth and cold no longer feels like opposition. It feels like coexistence. A faint exchange of words occurs near the hearth. The tone suggests confirmation of routine rather than instruction or urgency. The conversation ends quickly, leaving no trace except the memory of sound. The kitchen is no longer operating in cycles of activity and rest. It exists in a continuous low state of maintenance. The fire burns, the pots remain warm, The room holds itself together through minimal intervention. You become aware of your breathing again, though it is no longer something you direct attention toward. It aligns naturally with the slow rhythm of the environment. The boundary between your awareness and the kitchen itself feels increasingly indistinct. A final adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them into a tighter formation. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated but not brighter. It is a consolidation rather than an increase. The hearth holds its structure with the quiet stability. A quirky detail preserved in some regional medieval kitchen traditions describes how workers sometimes arranged embers overnight into compact shapes, believed to help preserve heat efficiency and ease morning relighting. Whether practical or habitual, that practice reflects the careful attention given to maintaining continuity through the night. The kitchen remains suspended in deep night, held together by soft firelight, stable warmth, and the quiet endurance of shared stillness. The night has settled into its most subdued form now, the kind where even time feels like it has stopped insisting on being noticed. The kitchen is still active in the smallest possible sense, but it is no longer performing any obvious work. It is simply sustaining itself, like a living memory that refuses to fade. The hearth remains the only true centre of attention, though even that centre feels softened, its edges blurred into a steady, low glow. You are still lying in your corner near the fire, and by now your sense of separation from the environment has thinned considerably. The straw beneath you no longer registers as individual pieces. It has become a continuous surface shaped by long stillness. The stone beneath it remains cold, but that cold is no longer interpreted as discomfort. It is just another layer of the room, as present and unchanging as the walls. Across the kitchen, a servant moves slowly along the hearthline, checking each suspended pot in sequence. Their movements are so controlled that they seem almost rehearsed by memory alone. A brief pause at each vessel, a slight tilt to observe contents, then moving on without interruption. Nothing is adjusted unless absolutely necessary. The routine is about confirmation, not correction. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, night kitchen practice often emphasized the preservation of embers and slow maintenance of heated vessels rather than active cooking, ensuring readiness for early morning demands without the need to relight fires from scratch. That underlying principle is visible in the way everything here is oriented toward continuity rather than change. The fire itself has become remarkably still in its behavior. It no longer flares or collapses noticeably. Instead, it maintains a compact, steady glow that pulses faintly within the embers. The light it produces is minimal but persistent, enough to define presence without fully illuminating the room. You notice how the air has taken on a fully stabilized character. Earlier shifts in smoke density and heat flow have disappeared into a single consistent atmosphere. The scent of ash, wood, and lingering food has blended into something neutral, no longer distinct enough to separate into individual components. A cook stands near a table with their hands resting lightly on its surface. They are not actively preparing anything. Instead, they appear to be observing the condition of what is already in place. After a moment, they step away without making any changes. The action feels like confirmation rather than labour. A lesser-known detail preserved in some medieval household inventories describes how kitchens sometimes organised their hearth spaces into distinct heat zones, allowing different levels of warmth to be used simultaneously for storage. Warming, or slow simmering, without disturbing the central ember bed. That layered thermal arrangement is subtly visible here in the way heat seems unevenly distributed across the room. You shift slightly, and the straw produces only a faint, almost indistinguishable rustle. Even movement feels partially absorbed before it fully registers. A nearby worker glances briefly toward the hearth, then returns to adjusting a hanging chain that supports a pot over the embers. The metal gives a soft, restrained creak and then settles. The fire responds to small internal shifts with minimal reaction, a slight tightening of glow, then a return to steady form. There is no dramatic change, only adjustment within balance. The hearth now behaves like something self-regulating, requiring only occasional guidance. A quieter observation from archaeological studies of medieval kitchen remains notes that repeated long-term use of hearth areas often leaves distinct heat patterns in surrounding stone, with subtle variations in coloration and texture, revealing zones of frequent activity that were never formally recorded but remain visible centuries later. That sense of accumulated presence feels almost tangible here. You lean back slightly against the wall. The stone is still cold, but the sensation has softened into neutrality. It no longer interrupts awareness. Instead, it forms part of the overall environment in which warmth and cold coexist without conflict. A faint exchange of words occurs near the hearth. The tone is low and functional, suggesting confirmation of routine rather than instruction. It ends quickly, dissolving immediately back into silence. The kitchen no longer feels like a place of production or preparation. It feels like a maintained equilibrium. The fire continues to burn, the pots continue to hold warmth. The room continues to exist through small, periodic adjustments that preserve its state. You become more aware of your breathing again, though it is no longer something you consciously regulate. It aligns naturally with the rhythm of the environment. The boundary between your presence and the kitchen's atmosphere feels increasingly faint. A finer adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them into a tighter cluster. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated but not brighter. It is refinement rather than a change in intensity. A quirky detail preserved in some regional medieval kitchen traditions mentions that workers sometimes shaped embers into compact formations overnight to maintain steady heat and simplify relighting in the morning, treating the fire as something to be carefully held rather than extinguished and restarted. That practice reflects the deep attention given to continuity in environments where warmth was essential for survival. The kitchen remains in deep night, held together by low firelight, softened sound, and the quiet persistence of shared stillness. The kitchen has reached a depth of stillness that feels almost structured, as if silence itself has taken on architecture. Nothing has stopped, yet nothing is advancing either. The space holds itself in place through habit, warmth, and repetition. The hearth remains the only living centre. Though even it now feels more like a memory of fire than fire itself, its glow is low, concentrated, and steady, like something carefully preserved rather than actively burning. You are still in your corner near the hearth, and by now your body has adapted so fully to the environment that it no longer distinguishes sharply between comfort and condition. The straw beneath you is fully compressed, forming a shallow imprint that feels permanent in its familiarity. The stone beneath remains cold, but that cold has become neutral, no longer interrupting your awareness. Across the kitchen, a servant moves with unhurried precision along the edge of the hearth, checking each suspended pot in sequence. Their actions are minimal but exact, a slight lift, a brief pause, a small adjustment if needed. Then moving on. Nothing is excessive. Everything is measured in restraint rather than force. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, nighttime hearth supervision often included continuous monitoring of heat stability to ensure that embers remained viable for morning relighting, and that stored food vessels maintained safe temperatures through the night. That operational continuity is visible here in the way every movement is oriented toward preservation rather than production. The fire itself behaves almost like a controlled breath. Embers cluster tightly, glowing in slow pulses that rise and fall without ever fully intensifying. The light they produce is soft enough that it no longer defines space sharply. Instead, it suggests boundaries rather than drawing them clearly. You notice how the air has become completely uniform. Earlier fluctuations in smoke density, scent, and heat have resolved into a single stable atmosphere. The smell of ash, wood, and faint remnants of cooked food is no longer separable into distinct layers. It exists as a continuous presence within the room. A cook stands near a table, hands resting lightly on its surface, observing a pot without interacting with it. After a moment, they nod slightly and step away. The action carries no sense of urgency or correction. It is simply confirmation that conditions remain within expected range. A lesser-known detail preserved in some medieval household inventories describes how certain kitchens arranged hearth spaces into multiple thermal zones, allowing different temperatures to coexist within the same fire structure for purposes such as warming vessels, slow cooking, and maintaining embers overnight. That layered thermal logic is subtly reflected here in the uneven distribution of glow and heat around the hearth. You shift slightly, and the straw produces only the faintest suggestion of movement. Even sound feels reluctant to fully emerge. A nearby worker glances briefly toward the hearth, then resumes adjusting a hanging chain supporting a pot. The metal gives a muted creak before settling again into silence. The fire responds to internal shifts with minimal change, a slight tightening of glow, then a return to its steady formation. There is no instability, only adjustment within equilibrium. The hearth now behaves less like a source of energy and more like a maintained condition. A quieter observation from archaeological studies of medieval kitchen sites notes that repeated long-term exposure to hearth heat often results in distinctive surface transformations in surrounding stone, revealing subtle gradients of wear and coloration that map the invisible geography of daily movement and fire management over many years. That sense of accumulated presence feels almost tangible in the stillness around you. You lean back slightly against the wall. The stone is still cold, but the sensation no longer stands in opposition to warmth. Instead, both conditions coexist without conflict. Your awareness holds them together without needing to resolve the difference. A faint exchange of words occurs near the hearth. The tone is low, functional, and brief. It suggests confirmation of routine rather than instruction or correction. The conversation ends almost immediately, leaving silence intact. The kitchen no longer feels like a place of activity. It feels like a maintained balance. Fire, air, and structure remain in place through continuous but minimal adjustment. Nothing is being created or concluded. Everything is being sustained. You become more aware of your breathing, though even that awareness is soft and unforced. It aligns naturally with the slow rhythm of the room. The boundary between your presence and the environment feels thinner than before, as if both are part of the same continuous system. A final adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them closer together into a compact formation. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated but does not intensify. It is a refinement of structure rather than energy. A quirky detail preserved in some regional medieval kitchen traditions suggests that workers often shaped overnight embers into compact clusters to preserve residual heat and ensure easier morning ignition. Treating the fire as something to be carefully maintained rather than allowed to fully rest. That practice reflects the emphasis placed on continuity in environments where warmth and readiness were essential. The kitchen remains suspended in deep night, held together by low firelight, softened sound, and the quiet endurance of shared stillness. The kitchen has become something closer to a held breath than a functioning room. It is still alive in the simplest sense, yet its life is now expressed through continuity rather than motion. The fire remains in its low, concentrated form, glowing within the hearth like a contained memory of all the heat it has produced throughout the night. It no longer reaches outward with force. Instead, it stays gathered, steady and self-contained. You remain in your corner near the hearth, and by now your sense of the room has softened into something almost bodily. It is not that you are inside the kitchen so much as you are part of its temperature, part of its slow circulation of warmth and cold. The straw beneath you has completely ceased to register as individual material. It is simply the shape of where you rest. Across the kitchen, movement continues at a minimal level. A servant passes slowly along the edge of the hearth, checking each pot with a brief, practiced glance. There is no hesitation in their rhythm. Each action is precise but unremarkable, as if repeated so many times that it no longer requires conscious thought. After the final check, they step back into shadow without altering anything. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, large kitchens often functioned as continuous support spaces for both daytime feasts and overnight maintenance cycles, requiring staff to sustain low-level operations even during periods of reduced activity. That underlying structure is present here in this way. Everything continues without interruption, even as intensity has faded. The fire itself is now almost sculptural in its stillness. Embers cluster tightly together, forming a compact core of glowing heat. The light they produce is subdued but persistent, enough to define presence without shaping strong shadows. The room feels less illuminated and more gently revealed. You notice how the air is stabilized into complete uniformity. Earlier variations in smoke density, scent, and heat have fully blended into a single continuous atmosphere. The smell of ash, wood, and faint remnants of food is no longer separable. It exists as part of the environment rather than something carried through it. A cook stands near a table with their hands resting lightly on the surface. They are not actively engaged in preparation. Instead, they observe a pot briefly, then step away. The action suggests confirmation rather than correction, as if everything has already reached its intended state. A lesser-known detail preserved in some medieval household documentation describes how certain kitchens organize their hearths into layered heat zones, allowing different intensities of warmth to exist simultaneously for purposes such as keeping vessels warm, maintaining embers, and supporting slow cooking processes without disturbing the central fire structure. That principle becomes visible here in the subtle gradients of glow and temperature across the hearth. You shift slightly, and the straw produces almost no sound at all. Even movement feels partially absorbed before it fully emerges. A nearby worker glances briefly toward the fire, then resumes adjusting a hanging chain supporting a pot. The metal gives a soft, muted creak before settling again into silence. The fire responds to minor internal shifts with minimal change, a slight tightening of glow, then a return to its steady state. There is no instability, only continuous equilibrium. The hearth now behaves less like an active source and more like a maintained condition that sustains itself through balance. A quieter observation from archaeological studies of medieval kitchen remains notes that repeated long-term exposure to hearth environments often leaves subtle but consistent alterations in surrounding stone surfaces, revealing patterns of heat concentration and human movement that accumulate gradually over years of use. That sense of layered presence feels almost tangible in the stillness around you. You lean back slightly against the wall. The stone remains cold, but the sensation no longer disrupts awareness. It exists alongside warmth without conflict, forming part of a balanced environment that no longer requires adjustment. A faint exchange of words occurs near the hearth. The tone is subdued and functional, suggesting confirmation of routine rather than instruction. It ends quickly, dissolving back into silence without trace. The kitchen no longer feels like a workspace, it feels like a sustained equilibrium. Fire, air, and structure remain in place through continuous but minimal maintenance. Nothing is actively being created or concluded, everything is being preserved. You become more aware of your breathing again, though it is no longer something you focus on deliberately. It aligns naturally with the rhythm of the room, as if both are part of the same underlying system. The boundary between your awareness and the kitchen itself feels increasingly faint. A final adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them into a tighter, more compact formation. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated but does not increase in brightness. It is refinement rather than expansion. A quirky detail preserved in some regional medieval kitchen traditions suggests that workers often shaped embers into compact clusters overnight to preserve residual heat and ensure ease of morning ignition. Treating the fire as something carefully maintained rather than allowed to fully dissipate. That practice reflects the deep importance placed on continuity in environments where warmth and readiness were essential. The kitchen remained suspended in deep night, held together by low firelight, softened sound, and the quiet persistence of shared stillness. The night has reached its final thinning, the point where darkness no longer feels heavy, but instead feels stretched and almost transparent. The kitchen is still intact, still functioning in its quiet way, but it no longer behaves like a place designed for work or even maintenance. It feels like a space that is simply waiting, held together by habit and the last patient pulse of heat. You remain in your corner near the hearth, and your body has fully surrendered to the logic of stillness. There is no longer any clear separation between comfort and environment. The straw beneath you has become indistinguishable from rest itself, no longer noticed as material or texture. The cold stone beneath it exists, but it is distant in awareness, like something remembered rather than felt. Across the kitchen, a servant moves slowly along the hearth line, checking the embers with minimal interruption. Their presence is quiet, almost ceremonial in its restraint. Each glance is brief, each adjustment smaller than the last. The fire does not respond dramatically anymore. It simply acknowledges each touch with a faint shift in glow before returning to its steady, compact form. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, night hearth supervision often extended until the earliest pre-dawn hours, ensuring that embers remained viable for relighting and that stored vessels retained safe warmth levels until morning activity began. That underlying continuity is still visible here in the way the room refuses to fully disengage, even as activity fades. The air has reached complete uniformity. Earlier traces of smoke movement, scent variation, and heat layering have dissolved into a single continuous atmosphere. What remains is not absence of smell, but a blended presence of wood ash, faint herbs, and the memory of cooking that no longer separates itself into identifiable parts. A cook stands near a table with their hands resting lightly on the surface. They are no longer actively preparing anything. Instead, they observe briefly, then step away. The motion suggests verification rather than intervention, as if the state of everything has already been accepted as stable. A lesser-known detail preserved in some medieval estate documentation describes how certain kitchens organize their hearth spaces into carefully maintained heat gradients, allowing multiple levels of warmth to exist simultaneously for different purposes, such as slow cooking, vessel warming, and ember preservation without disturbing the central fire core. That layered thermal arrangement can be felt in the uneven but stable distribution of glow across the hearth. You shift slightly, and the straw produces almost no audible response. Even movement seems partially absorbed by the stillness of the room. A nearby worker glances toward the fire, then resumes adjusting a suspended pot chain. The metal emits a soft, restrained creak before settling again into silence. The fire itself has become almost entirely self-contained. Embers remain clustered in a tight formation, producing a low, steady glow that rises and falls in slow, barely perceptible pulses. There is no longer any sense of fluctuation, only persistence. A quieter observation from archaeological studies of medieval kitchen sites suggests that repeated long-term use of hearth areas often leaves subtle but measurable changes in surrounding stone surfaces, revealing patterns of heat exposure and human movement that accumulate gradually over many years of continuous occupation. That sense of layered presence feels embedded in the room itself, as if the kitchen carries its own history within its structure. You lean back slightly against the wall. The stone is still cold, but it no longer registers as opposition to warmth. Instead, it exists as part of a balanced environment where contrasting conditions coexist without conflict. A faint exchange of words occurs near the hearth. The tone is low and functional, suggesting confirmation of routine rather than instruction or correction. It ends quickly, leaving no residual emphasis in the air. The kitchen no longer feels like a place of production or even maintenance. It has become a sustained equilibrium. Fire, air, and structure remain in place through minimal, almost invisible adjustments. Nothing is being created, nothing is being concluded, everything is being held. You become aware of your breathing again, though it is no longer something you actively notice. It follows the rhythm of the room naturally, as if both are expressions of the same underlying stability. The boundary between your awareness and the kitchen's atmosphere continues to thin. A final adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them into a tighter cluster. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated but does not increase in brightness. It is refinement rather than change, a final shaping of stability. A quirky detail preserved in some regional medieval kitchen traditions describes how workers often formed embers into compact arrangements overnight to preserve residual heat and ensure easier morning ignition, treating the fire as something carefully maintained rather than allowed to fully fade. That practice reflects the importance placed on continuity in environments where warmth was essential for survival and daily function. The kitchen remains suspended in deep night, held together by low firelight, softened sound, and the quiet endurance of shared stillness. The kitchen no longer feels like a place moving through time. It feels like time has simply thinned out here, stretched so gently across stone and ember that it no longer has edges you can clearly notice. Everything is still present, yet everything is reduced to its quietest possible version. The fire remains, but it is no longer acting like a source of transformation. It's only maintaining itself, a low clustered glow that breathes in place without expanding. You remain in your corner near the hearth, and your body has reached a state where comfort and environment are no longer separate ideas. The straw beneath you is fully flattened into a resting contour that no longer draws attention. The stone beneath it is still cold, but that cold no longer rises into awareness in any meaningful way. It is simply part of the background of being here. Across the kitchen, movement is now almost symbolic rather than functional. A servant crosses slowly from one side to the other, pauses near a hanging pot, observes it briefly, and continues without adjustment. There is no urgency left in any motion. Everything is confirmation. Nothing is correction. In medieval castle households during the early 14th century, the final hours of kitchen watch often focused on preserving ember beds and ensuring that vessels remained warm enough for early morning use, allowing the next cycle of activity to begin without the need to reconstruct heat from nothing. That continuity is still present here, embedded in every quiet action that prevents the fire from fully fading. The fire itself is now a compact concentration of warmth. Embers sit tightly together, glowing in a steady, low rhythm that rises and falls almost imperceptibly. It no longer casts strong light or creates defined shadows. Instead, it produces a soft presence that gently confirms its own existence. You notice how the air has become entirely uniform. All earlier variation in smoke, scent, and temperature has resolved into a single continuous atmosphere. The smell of ash, wood, and faint remnants of cooked food is no longer separable into parts. It is simply the atmosphere of the kitchen itself. A cook stands near a table with hands resting lightly on the surface. They are not preparing anything. They are not correcting anything. They simply observe for a moment, then step away. The gesture is minimal, almost ritual in its quiet confirmation that everything remains as it should. A lesser-known detail preserved in medieval estate documentation describes how some kitchens maintained layered heat zones within their hearth structures, allowing different levels of warmth to exist simultaneously for tasks such as slow warming. ember preservation, and controlled heating of stored vessels without disturbing the central fire core. That layered structure is reflected here in the subtle differences in glow and warmth across the hearth space. You shift slightly, and the straw produces almost no sound at all. Even movement feels partially absorbed before it fully registers. A nearby worker glances toward the hearth, then resumes adjusting a suspended pot chain. The metal gives a soft, restrained creak before settling back into silence. The fire responds only minimally to change now, a faint tightening of glow as embers settle, then a return to steady equilibrium. There is no longer any sense of reaction, only continuation. A quieter observation from archaeological studies of medieval kitchen sites suggests that repeated long-term use of hearth spaces often leaves layered thermal signatures in surrounding stone surfaces, revealing subtle patterns of occupation, movement, and heat exposure that accumulate gradually over decades of continuous use. That sense of accumulated presence feels embedded in the room, as if the kitchen itself remembers every night it has held. You lean back slightly against the wall. The stone remains cold, but it no longer stands in contrast to warmth. Instead, both conditions exist together without conflict, forming a balanced environment that no longer requires adjustment. A faint exchange of words occurs near the hearth. The tone is low and functional, suggesting confirmation rather than instruction. It ends quickly, leaving no echo of urgency behind. The kitchen is no longer operating as a workspace or even a maintenance space. It has become a sustained equilibrium of heat, structure, and shared presence. Fire, air, and stone remain in place through continuous but minimal adjustment. You become aware of your breathing again, though it is no longer something you consciously follow. It aligns naturally with the rhythm of the room, as if both your body and the kitchen are expressions of the same underlying stillness. A final adjustment is made to the embers, drawing them into a compact cluster. The glow becomes slightly more concentrated but not brighter. It is a final refinement of structure rather than energy. A quirky detail preserved in some regional medieval kitchen traditions describes how workers often shaped embers into tight formations overnight to preserve residual heat and ensure easier ignition at dawn. Treating the fire not as something to end, but as something carefully carried forward into the next day. That practice reflects the deep emphasis placed on continuity in environments where warmth and readiness were essential for survival. The kitchen remained suspended in deep night, held together by low firelight, softened sound, and the quiet endurance of shared stillness. The fire in the kitchen no longer feels like something you are watching. It feels like something you are slowly drifting away from. Its glow is still there, low and steady, but even that seems to soften as your attention loosens its grip on the room. The stone, the straw, the faint smell of wood smoke all begin to feel distant, as if they belong to another layer of time that is gently moving away from you. You remain lying in that quiet corner near the hearth, but the edges of the kitchen are no longer sharp. Sounds fade before they fully form. Movements become softer, slower, almost imagined rather than observed. The last embers hold their shape in a warm, dim cluster, and even that warmth feels like it is being shared with something larger and calmer than the room itself. There is no urgency left anywhere, no tasks waiting, no adjustments being made, only the lingering presence of heat against stone and the slow acceptance of night finishing its work. Your breathing becomes easier to follow, not because you are trying, but because everything else has become simpler. The kitchen, once full of motion and purpose, now feels like a memory that is still gently glowing, not disappearing, just easing into rest. And as you let go of the details one by one, the fire becomes less a place you are in and more a feeling you are carrying. Everything softens further, and finally, even that softness begins to fade into sleep. Sweet dreams.